April 7th, 1917, 9:30 in the morning. Apra Harbor, Guam. The tropical sun burned through scattered clouds, turning the harbor water into hammered silver. Lieutenant Owen Bartlett stood in the bow of a small launch, his white uniform already dark with sweat. Ahead of him, anchored in the center of the harbor, sat the SMS Cormoran, a German auxiliary cruiser that had been sitting in these same waters for 28 months. Behind him, in a slower barge, Lieutenant W.A. Hall commanded 18 sailors and 15 Marines. Between them, they carried orders that would change everything. Bartlett could see German sailors moving on the Cormoran's deck. Some leaned against the railings, others stood near the ship's boats. They were not at battle stations. They were not armed. For 2.5 years these men had been guests on this island, not quite prisoners, not quite free. They had walked Guam's streets in full uniform. They had attended dances. They had fallen in love with local women. Some had married. The Americans stationed here knew them by name, knew their faces, had shared meals and jokes and long evenings talking about home. But that morning, everything had changed. 6 hours earlier, across the international dateline in Washington, D.C., President Woodrow Wilson had signed a declaration of war against Germany. The cable had reached Governor Roy C. Smith's office at 2:47 a.m. Guam time, 3 words that ended a friendship: war with Germany. Now Bartlett carried those words across the harbor. In his pocket, folded twice, were written orders. The Cormoran and her crew were to be seized as hostile combatants. The ship that had sat peacefully in this harbor for 852 days was now an enemy vessel. The men who had danced with Chamorro women at the governor's mansion were now prisoners of war. Bartlett did not know, could not know, that the next 10 minutes would mark America's first violent engagement with Germany in World War I, that the first shots would be fired here, 7,000 miles from the trenches of Europe, that the first German prisoners of war would be these men, these sailors he'd seen walking the streets of Hagåtña, eating at the same restaurants, shopping at the same stores. He did not know that 7 men would be dead before noon. What he did know, what everyone on Guam understood, was that something profound was ending. Captain Adalbert Zuckschwerdt, the Cormoran's commander, a mountainous man with a quiet voice who had become a fixture at official functions, had a decision to make: surrender the ship he'd commanded for 3 years, or destroy it. And men who had lived as friends for 28 months would, within minutes, become enemies, pointing guns at each other. The launch cut through the water. Bartlett could see Zuckschwerdt now, standing on deck in his full dress uniform. The German captain knew why they were coming. Every man on that ship knew. The question that hung in the humid morning air, the question that would determine whether anyone died that day, was simple. What happens when friendship meets war? Within 3 hours, the SMS Cormoran would rest 110 feet below the surface of Apra Harbor. 7 German sailors would be dead. 350 survivors would begin a journey to prisoner-of-war camps in Utah and Georgia. And Guam, a small American territory barely noticed by the rest of the world, would become the place where the United States fired its first shots in the Great War. Today, welcome to this channel, and to an authentic World War II story, in which ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. My name is Dr. Franklin J. Carter. I'm 80 years old, and I have been telling stories of war for decades. If you are ready to follow me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting, so sit down and follow me to the end. But to understand how these men arrived at this impossible moment, we need to go back 28 months. Back to December 1914, when a desperate German raider limped into this same harbor, burning coconut husks for fuel, praying the Americans wouldn't blow them out of the water. December 1914, the Great War was 4 months old. In Europe, the trenches had already swallowed hundreds of thousands of men. The Battle of the Marne had stopped the German advance on Paris. At Ypres, British and German soldiers had clawed at each other through mud and poison gas. The Western Front had frozen into a line of death that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Over 800,000 men were already dead. Another 3 million were wounded. And the war had barely begun. But the war was global. German colonies dotted the Pacific, the Marianas, the Carolines, Palau, the Marshall Islands, and parts of New Guinea. These territories, acquired in the scramble for empire during the 1890s, were now targets. Japan had entered the war on the Allied side in August, eager to seize Germany's Asian holdings. The German East Asia Squadron, a collection of cruisers based in Tsingtao, China, had scattered across the Pacific, hunted by Japanese and British warships. Most of these ships would never reach home. The squadron's flagship, SMS Scharnhorst, would be sunk off the Falkland Islands with all hands. SMS Emden, a legendary raider, would be run aground and destroyed off Sumatra. One by one, Germany's Pacific Fleet was being hunted down and eliminated. In the United States, President Wilson declared neutrality. America would not take sides in Europe's war, but neutrality had rules. Under the Hague Convention, neutral ports could provide limited assistance to belligerent vessels, enough coal to reach the nearest friendly port. Enough food and water for the journey, nothing more, and if a warship couldn't leave within 24 hours, it had to submit to internment for the duration of the war. These rules would determine the fate of the SMS Cormoran and her 373 crew members. The ship herself had a strange history. She'd been built in Germany in 1909 as the SS Ryazan, a Russian merchant vessel, a combination passenger, cargo, and mail carrier. She was 285 feet long, painted white, with 2 masts and a single smokestack. She carried a crew of about 200 in peacetime and could make 15 knots when her engines were running properly. When the war broke out in August 1914, the Ryazan was in the wrong place. She was steaming near Korea when the German cruiser SMS Emden intercepted her. Russia and Germany were enemies now. The Emden's captain ordered the Russian crew off the ship, took her as a prize, and sailed her to Tsingtao. At Tsingtao, the original SMS Cormoran, a small gunboat, sat in harbor with engines too damaged to repair. The Germans stripped her 8 rapid-fire guns and mounted them on the captured Russian steamer. They renamed the vessel SMS Cormoran II. She was now an auxiliary cruiser, a merchant raider armed for commerce warfare. Command went to Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Zuckschwerdt. Zuckschwerdt was 40 years old, born January 1, 1874, in the small town of Worbis in central Germany. He joined the Imperial German Navy as a midshipman in April 1893, when he was 19. For 21 years he'd served on ships across the world, rising through the ranks. He was a gunnery officer, known for precision and calm under pressure. He'd served in the German colony of Kiautschou Bay, toured the Pacific, and visited Australia in 1913 aboard the SMS Rune. Those who knew him described him the same way. Large, handsome, mountainous, with wide shoulders and a decisive personality. A quiet man who never raised his voice, never used profanity, and avoided harsh exchanges at all costs. But beneath the quiet exterior was stubbornness. And a social consciousness unusual for German naval officers in the colonies. He cared about his men. He remembered their names. He listened to their complaints. He made sure they were fed, clothed, and paid. In August 1914, Zuckschwerdt received his orders. Take the Cormoran into the South Pacific, harass Allied shipping, capture merchant vessels, disrupt supply lines, be a thorn in the side of the British and Japanese navies. The Cormoran left Tsingtao on August 10, 1914. She carried 355 men. German sailors, yes, but also Chinese laborers, New Guinean recruits from German colonies, a few civilians fleeing the war zone. The ship was crowded, food was already tight. And the engine, the same engine that had crippled the original Cormoran, was unreliable. For 4 months, Zuckschwerdt played cat and mouse across the Pacific. He sailed to the Solomon Islands, to New Guinea, to Yap. He picked up stranded German citizens and rescued sailors from disabled vessels, but he never captured a single enemy ship. He never fired his guns in combat. Every time he got close to a target, Japanese cruisers appeared on the horizon. Faster ships, better armed, hunting him. By December, the Cormoran was in desperate condition. Coal supplies were critically low. They'd burned everything that would combust: furniture, spare wood, coconut husks gathered at remote atolls. Food was down to rice and whatever fish they could catch. The crew was exhausted, sick of the endless running, sick of the cramped conditions, sick of the fear. Zuckschwerdt considered scuttling the ship at Lamatrek, a remote atoll in the Carolines. They could sink her in the lagoon, go native, wait out the war in the palm trees. But he decided against it. These were sailors, not castaways. They needed civilization. They needed a port. On December 13, 1914, the Cormoran turned north, 450 miles to Guam, the nearest territory with a harbor deep enough for a ship of her size. Guam belonged to the United States now, seized from Spain in 1898. The Americans maintained a small naval station there, a coaling facility, a wireless station, and a garrison of Marines. The United States was neutral. Zuckschwerdt knew the Americans couldn't help him much under the Hague Convention. But maybe they'd bend the rules. Give him enough coal to reach Manila, or Singapore, or even back to Germany if he could find a route. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. The Cormoran limped into Apra Harbor on December 14, 1914. Her bunkers were nearly empty. Her hull needed repairs. Her crew was gaunt, hungry, desperate, and waiting for them, guns loaded and aimed, was the USS Supply, Guam's station ship, and the shore batteries of Fort Santa Cruz, 3 7-inch naval guns that commanded the entire harbor. The Americans could have blown the Cormoran out of the water. Under the rules of neutrality, they had every right. A warship from a belligerent nation entering a neutral port without permission was fair game. But they didn't fire. Instead, Governor William J. Maxwell sent a message to the German ship: "State your business." Zuckschwerdt's reply was simple. He needed 1,500 tons of coal and a 30-day supply of food and water. Enough to reach German East Africa, the nearest German territory, thousands of miles away across the Indian Ocean. Maxwell's response was equally simple: no. Guam had coal, but not much. The island's supplies were meant for American ships, not German raiders. And even if Maxwell wanted to help, the Hague Convention was clear. He could provide enough coal to reach the nearest port, nothing more. And the nearest port that would welcome a German warship no longer existed. The British controlled the seas to the west. The Japanese controlled everything to the north. There was nowhere for the Cormoran to go. Maxwell gave Zuckschwerdt 2 choices: leave within 24 hours or submit to internment for the duration of the war. Zuckschwerdt chose internment. On December 15, 1914, the SMS Cormoran anchored in Apra Harbor. Her guns were removed and stored in American facilities. Her radio was allowed to receive messages but not transmit. A small supply of coal was kept aboard in case bad weather forced her to move to open sea for safety, but otherwise she was immobilized. A warship trapped in a gilded cage, and her crew, 373 men, became the first Germans interned by the United States in World War I. What none of them knew, what Zuckschwerdt could not have predicted, was that this internment would last not weeks, not months, but 852 days. 2 years and 4 months. Long enough for enemies to become neighbors. Long enough for strangers to become friends. Long enough that when war finally came to Guam, the men who would point guns at each other would know each other's names. At first, the internment was harsh. Governor Maxwell was not a friendly man. He was 55 years old, a career naval officer, rigid in his interpretation of the rules. The Cormoran's crew was confined to the ship. They could not go ashore. They could not interact with the local population. Armed guards on the USS Supply watched them day and night. The 3 shore batteries remained manned and aimed at the German vessel. The crew lived in cramped quarters, over 370 men packed into a ship designed for 200. The tropical heat was suffocating. Below decks, the temperature reached 110 degrees. Men slept in shifts. They exercised on deck when they could. They fished off the stern. They read the same books over and over. They played cards. They waited. For the first year, this was their life, a floating prison in paradise. They could see Guam's green hills, could smell the tropical flowers, could hear the sounds of the island, church bells on Sunday, children playing, the rhythms of a community going about its daily life. But they could not be part of it. Then, in late 1915, everything changed. Governor Maxwell became ill. A tropical fever laid him low. In November 1915, he was relieved of duty and sent back to the United States for treatment. His replacement, on an interim basis, was Captain William P. Cronin, commander of the USS Supply. Cronin looked at the situation and saw something Maxwell had missed. These men were not a threat. They had no way to escape. Their ship was disarmed. Guam was surrounded by Allied naval forces. The war in the Pacific was effectively over, and Germany's colonies were seized or blockaded. Keeping these sailors confined to a ship for the entire war was pointless cruelty. Cronin issued new orders. The Cormoran's crew could come ashore. They had to wear a full uniform. They had to stay within designated areas, from Tuman in the north to Piti in the south, roughly the main settled areas of the island. They had to report their movements, but otherwise they were free. The effect was immediate. German sailors began appearing in Hagåtña's streets. They walked along Marine Corps Drive. They ate at local restaurants. They attended Mass at the cathedral. They visited the market, bought local goods and tried Chamorro food. Some had money, wages they'd saved before the war. Others took odd jobs, repairing things, teaching German and music, doing work the small American garrison couldn't cover. And slowly, hesitantly, friendships formed. The German sailors were educated men. Most spoke some English. Many were skilled tradesmen, machinists, carpenters, and electricians. Guam was a small, isolated territory. It had fewer than 12,000 people. The American garrison numbered maybe 400 Marines and sailors. The arrival of 370 Germans, many of them young, many of them starved for conversation and companionship after a year in confinement, changed the social dynamics of the island. American military personnel invited German officers to dinners. Governor Cronin hosted events where American and German naval officers mingled, discussed ships and navigation, and the relative merits of different naval tactics. It was surreal, two groups of men who would be killing each other if they met at sea, sharing cocktails and talking about the weather. But the deepest connections were formed between the German sailors and the Chamorro people. The Chamorros were the indigenous people of Guam. They'd lived there for thousands of years before Spanish colonization in the 1600s. When the Americans took the island in 1898, the Chamorro population was recovering from centuries of disease and displacement. They were farmers, fishermen, and small traders. They spoke Chamorro and Spanish, and increasingly English as the Americans pushed their language and culture. To the Chamorros, the German sailors were exotic, foreign, but not threatening. They were stranded men, far from home, trying to make the best of a bad situation. And many of them were kind. They helped repair homes. They taught music. Some of the sailors were accomplished musicians. They participated in festivals. They learned Chamorro phrases. They genuinely tried to fit in. Romance was inevitable. Young German sailors met young Chamorro women at dances, at church, and at social gatherings organized by the American administration. Some of these encounters were fleeting. Others deepened into genuine affection. By 1916, several German sailors had married Chamorro women in Catholic ceremonies in Hagåtña. These marriages created complicated legal situations as German nationals married to American territorial subjects, while Germany and the United States maintained strained neutrality, but nobody seemed to care much. The island was too small for such formalities to matter. Captain Zuckschwerdt moved ashore. He rented a house in Hagotnya. His wife Penelope was Greek, and she'd been unable to join him in the Pacific, but he maintained his quarters as a gentleman would. He attended social functions. He became a known figure on the island, the large German captain who never raised his voice, who spoke excellent English, who seemed genuinely interested in the island's history and culture. For 6 months, from November 1915 to April 1916, this strange peace held. Then, Governor Cronin was replaced by Captain Roy C. Smith, the permanent governor. Smith was younger than Maxwell, more pragmatic, but also more aware of the deteriorating relationship between the United States and Germany. In Europe, the war had become a slaughterhouse. The Battle of Verdun was consuming thousands of lives daily. The Somme would soon do the same. At sea, German U-boats were sinking merchant ships, American ships sometimes among them. The Lusitania had gone down in May 1915 with 128 Americans aboard. Diplomatic relations between Washington and Berlin were icy. Smith continued Cronin's policies. The German crew remained free to move about the island, but he watched them more carefully. He ordered periodic inspections of the Cormoran. He wanted to make sure the Germans weren't hoarding coal, weren't preparing to make a run for it. In early 1917, Smith's suspicions proved correct. During an inspection, American sailors found hidden coal reserves aboard the Cormoran. Not enough to reach a German port, but enough to make Smith nervous. He ordered the extra coal removed. He tightened restrictions slightly. German officers who'd been living ashore, including Zuckschwerdt, moved back to the ship. Everyone could feel the tension building. In February 1917, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare. Any ship, neutral or not, found in waters around Britain would be sunk without warning. American ships. American lives. President Wilson broke diplomatic relations with Germany. On Guam, the German sailors knew what was coming. They'd been watching the war from a distance for 2 years. They knew that American entry was likely, perhaps inevitable. And they knew what it would mean for them. The comfortable semi-freedom they'd enjoyed would end. They'd become enemy combatants, prisoners of war. The friendships they'd built, the lives they'd carved out on this small island, would evaporate overnight. Some of the sailors talked about what they'd do when war came. Some wanted to fight, to seize the island, destroy the cable station that connected Guam to the outside world, then flee before reinforcements arrived. It was a fantasy. The American garrison outnumbered them. The shore batteries would sink the Cormoran before she cleared the harbor. Any attack would be suicide. Others talked about surrendering peacefully. They'd done their duty. They'd served Germany for 2 years in impossible circumstances. If war came, they'd lay down their arms and accept imprisonment. They'd survive the war and go home when it ended. Zuckschwerdt listened to all these discussions. He was their captain. The decision would be his. But he didn't share his thinking. He kept his own counsel. He waited. On the morning of April 7, 1917, the waiting ended. The cable arrived at 2:47 a.m. Governor Smith read it twice. Then he summoned his senior officers. At 9 a.m., Lieutenant Owen Bartlett and Lieutenant William Lafrenz received their orders. They would board the Cormoran under a flag of truce. They would inform Captain Zuckschwerdt that a state of war existed between the United States and Germany. They would demand the immediate surrender of the ship and crew. Lieutenant W.A. Hall received different orders. He would follow in a slower barge with 18 sailors and 15 Marines. If the Germans refused to surrender, if they attempted to scuttle the ship or resist seizure, Hall was authorized to use force. At 9:20 a.m., the 2 boats left the American base at Sumy. The launch carrying Bartlett and Lafrenz moved fast, cutting across the harbor toward the Cormoran. Hall's barge followed more slowly. About halfway across, Hall spotted another boat. A small launch from the Cormoran, heading toward shore. It was the daily supply run. German sailors sent to pick up provisions from local vendors. Hall ordered his barge to intercept. The German launch slowed but didn't stop. Hall turned to one of his Marines. Corporal Michael B. Chalky. He gave an order, fire a warning shot across their bow. Chalky raised his rifle, aimed high, fired. The crack of the shot echoed across Apra Harbor. It was 9:26 a.m., Guam time. April 7, 1917. It was the first shot fired by American forces against Germany in World War I. Not in France, not in the Atlantic, but here, in a tropical harbor 7,000 miles from Europe, fired by a Marine whose name most history books would forget. The German launch stopped. The sailors aboard raised their hands. Hall's barge pulled alongside, and the Germans were taken into custody without resistance. They looked confused, frightened. One of them, an older machinist named Klaus, kept asking in broken English what was happening. Hall told him, America and Germany were at war. They were prisoners now. Klaus started crying. Meanwhile, Bartlett's launch reached the Cormoran. He climbed the ladder, followed by Lefren's. The deck was crowded with German sailors. They stood in small groups, talking quietly. They wore their uniforms. Some had packed bags at their feet. They knew. Captain Zuckschwerdt stood near the bridge. He was in full dress uniform, his boots polished, his posture erect. When Bartlett approached, Zuckschwerdt saluted. Bartlett returned the salute. Then he delivered his message. War had been declared. The Cormoran was now a hostile vessel. Captain Zuckschwerdt and his crew were prisoners of war. The ship must be surrendered immediately to the United States Navy. Zuckschwerdt listened without expression. When Bartlett finished, the German captain spoke in perfect English. I will surrender my crew, but I will not surrender my ship. Bartlett had expected this. Governor Smith had anticipated it. He repeated his orders. The United States would seize the Cormoran as a prize of war. Resistance would be met with force. The ship would be taken whether Zuckschwerdt cooperated or not. Zuckschwerdt's face remained calm. He asked for 10 minutes to consult with his officers. Bartlett agreed. He and Lefren's withdrew to the main deck, waiting. What they didn't know, what the Americans had no way of knowing, was that Zuckschwerdt had prepared for this moment. For months, since the diplomatic break in February, the Germans had been making contingency plans. Deep in the Cormoran's coal bunker, hidden among the remaining fuel, German sailors had placed an explosive charge. A demolition device wired to a detonator. If the ship couldn't be saved, she would be destroyed. Better to sink her than let her serve in an enemy navy. Zuckschwerdt gathered his officers. The conversation was brief. They all knew what had to be done. The Cormoran had been their home for nearly 3 years. She'd carried them across the Pacific, sheltered them, kept them alive. They couldn't let her fall into American hands. It would be a betrayal. The captain gave his orders. All hands abandon ship. Move quickly but calmly. Get into the launches and row to shore. There would be no resistance. No fighting. The Americans would rescue them. But the ship would go down. Zuckschwerdt returned to the main deck. He found Bartlett and Lefren's. He informed them that his crew would surrender peacefully. But he asked for time to evacuate the ship in an orderly fashion. He gave his word as an officer that there would be no violence. Bartlett was suspicious. He could see German sailors moving purposefully, gathering belongings, heading toward the launches. Something was happening. He sent Lefren's back to their launch to alert Hall's barge. Then he told Zuckschwerdt they had 5 minutes. Zuckschwerdt nodded. He turned and began shouting orders in German. The crew responded immediately. Men poured from below decks. They climbed into the ship's boats. Others jumped straight into the water, swimming for shore. The evacuation was controlled but rapid. Too rapid. Bartlett knew. He turned and ran for his launch. Lefren's was already at the ladder. They scrambled down, untied the boat, and started rowing back toward the American barge. They were 50 yards from the Cormoran when the explosion hit. The blast came from deep inside the ship. A muffled boom, followed by a geyser of smoke and debris. The Cormoran shuddered. Her hull buckled. Coal dust and splinters of wood shot into the air. The ship listed immediately to port, water pouring through the ruptured hull. German sailors still on deck dove into the harbor. Others, caught below when the charge detonated, never had a chance. The Cormoran rolled. Her masts swung toward the water. Men screamed. Some were trapped under falling rigging, others were sucked down as the ship settled. 4 minutes. That's how long it took. The Cormoran, a ship that had sailed across the Pacific, that had evaded British and Japanese warships for months, that had sat peacefully in Apra Harbor for 852 days, sank in 4 minutes. American boats converged on the site. The USS Supply, the station ship, launched every boat it had. Hall's barge turned back. Even Governor Smith's personal launch joined the rescue. American sailors pulled German sailors from the water. Some were injured, bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Others were in shock, shaking, unable to speak. A few were unconscious, dragged under by the suction of the sinking ship, and then bobbing back to the surface. The Americans worked fast. They didn't care that these men were now enemy combatants. They were drowning sailors. The rescue took over an hour. By the time the last man was pulled from the water, the count was clear. 366 men rescued, 7 men dead. The dead included Obersteuermann Bennershausen, who died of a heart attack in the water. Obermatrose Emil Reschke, also a heart attack. The shock was too much for his system. Obermaschinist Franz Blum, drowned. Obervermessungsgast Paul Burkhardt drowned. Obermatrose Hermann Glaser drowned. Matrose Rudolf Penning drowned. Heizer Ernst Roos drowned. Their bodies were recovered over the next several hours, only 6 of the 7. Paul Burkhardt's body was never found. He remained with the ship, 110 feet down in the harbor mud. The survivors were brought ashore. The USS Supply became a field hospital. American medics treated wounds, German and American. Governor Smith toured the deck, checking on the injured. When he found Captain Zuckschwerdt sitting on a crate with a bandage around his head, Smith stopped. The 2 men looked at each other. Enemy commanders, but also 2 naval officers who understood what had just happened. Smith spoke first. "Your men fought bravely, Captain. You gave them good orders. They followed them well." Zuckschwerdt nodded. His face was pale. "Thank you, Governor. I regret the deaths. I wish it could have been different." Smith didn't disagree. He gave orders for the survivors to be taken to temporary barracks at Camp Barnett and a second facility in Asan. The German crew would be held there until transport to the mainland could be arranged. The dead would be buried with full military honors. That last part was unusual. These men were enemy combatants. They'd destroyed American property, a ship the United States could have used. They'd resisted lawful orders. By the strict letter of military law, they could have been treated harshly. But Smith understood something important. These men had lived on Guam for 2 years. 3 days later, on April 10, 1917, the funeral was held. The 6 recovered bodies were carried in coffins draped with German naval flags. An honor guard of American Marines marched alongside. The coffins were placed in graves at the Naval Cemetery in Hagåtña. Governor Smith attended. So did most of the American garrison. So did hundreds of Chamorro residents. And so did the surviving crew of the Cormoran, under guard, but permitted to say goodbye to their shipmates. Captain Zuckschwerdt was allowed to speak. He stood before the graves and delivered a eulogy in German, translated by an American officer. He spoke of duty and sacrifice. He thanked the people of Guam for their kindness during the internment. He acknowledged that these men had died in a war not of their choosing, far from home, but they had died as sailors, doing their duty. When he finished, the German crew was given permission to erect a memorial. They built a small obelisk, about 1 meter high, made of cement. On it, they carved an inscription, Den Toten von SMS Cormoran, 7/4/1917. To the dead of the SMS Cormoran, April 7, 1917. The obelisk stands today. The 6 graves surround it marked with simple stones. Each stone bears a name and 2 words, German sailor. After the funeral, the crew was moved to the temporary camps. They lived there for 2 months while transport was arranged. During that time, the non-German crew members were separated out, 4 Chinese sailors and 29 New Guineans. These men had never been German citizens. They'd been colonial subjects, recruited or pressed into service. The Americans didn't know what to do with them. In the end, they were allowed to stay on Guam. The Chinese men found work as house servants or opened a laundry. The New Guineans became laborers, and they impressed the locals with their dancing and spear throwing. The 355 German sailors, including Zuckschwerdt, boarded the transport ship USAT Thomas on June 8, 1917. The Thomas was a former passenger liner, now converted for military use. She would carry them to San Francisco, then by train across the United States to Fort Douglas, Utah. The journey took 10 days. The Germans were confined below decks for most of the voyage. They were fed American military rations, which were better than what they'd had on the Cormoran, but not generous. They were allowed on deck in shifts for exercise. Some of the sailors were seasick, others were simply depressed. After 2 years on Guam, after the friendships they'd built, the marriages some had contracted, they were being taken to the other side of the world. To a prison camp in the mountains of Utah. None of them knew when, or if, they'd see Guam again. Thomas arrived in San Francisco on June 18, 1917. The Germans were marched off the ship under heavy guard. American newspapers covered their arrival. The first German prisoners of war on American soil. Photographs were taken. Curious crowds gathered to stare at the enemy. From San Francisco, they traveled by train. Across California, through Nevada, into Utah. The landscape changed from ocean to desert to mountains. Some of the Germans had never seen mountains like this. The Rockies towered over the train, snow-capped even in June. Fort Douglas sat on a bench of land east of Salt Lake City. It was an old post, established during the Civil War. Originally called Camp Douglas, it had been built to watch over the Mormon population and protect the overland mail route. By 1917, it was primarily a training facility, but it had barracks, a hospital, a stockade. It could hold prisoners. The Germans arrived at Fort Douglas on June 10, 1917. They were processed, photographed, and assigned numbers. Officers were separated from enlisted men, though they were allowed to interact during the day. Zuckschwerdt was given a small private room. The enlisted men lived in large barracks, 40 or 50 to a room. The camp was well organized. The Americans had studied the Geneva Convention. They knew the rules for treating prisoners of war, adequate food, medical care, humane conditions. Work was allowed but not compelled for officers. Enlisted men could volunteer for labor details and would be paid American military wages. The Germans found Fort Douglas strange. After 2 years on a tropical island, the Utah climate was shocking. Summer was hot and dry. Winter, they would learn, was brutally cold. The altitude made some of them sick. The food was American, bland to German tastes. But it was regular, and it was safe. Nobody was shooting at them. Nobody was hunting them across the Pacific. A typical day at Fort Douglas began at 6 a.m. A bugle sounded reveille. The men rose, washed, and dressed. At 7 a.m., breakfast in the mess hall. Oatmeal, bread, coffee, sometimes eggs, sometimes bacon. The Germans complained about the coffee, which was weak by European standards, but they drank it. After breakfast, roll call. The men stood in formation while American guards counted them. Then the day's assignments. Some men volunteered for work details. They were sent to nearby farms to harvest crops, or to local mills, or to construction projects around Salt Lake City. The work was hard, but not cruel. And it paid. 20 cents a day for enlisted men. Officers could not be compelled to work, so most didn't. Those who didn't work spent the day in camp. They could read, write letters, and play sports. The camp had a small athletic field. The Germans organized soccer teams and handball games. They held classes. Some of the more educated sailors taught English, mathematics, and engineering to younger crew members. It passed the time. Lunch at noon. Dinner at 6 p.m. Both meals were simple. Meat, potatoes, bread, and vegetables when available. The portions were adequate by military standards. Nobody went hungry, but nobody was satisfied either. Evenings were free time. The men gathered in the barracks. They talked about home, about the war, about Guam. Some wrote letters to the Chamorro women they'd married or fallen in love with. These letters had to pass through American censors, so they were careful about what they said, but the longing came through anyway. One of the sailors, Emil Bischoff, kept a detailed diary. Bischoff was 28 years old, a machinist from Unterscheflens, Germany. He joined the Navy in 1909, served on the SMS Augsburg and SMS Planet before joining the Cormoran. He was a rebellious sailor, opinionated, critical of how the Germans treated colonial subjects. But he was also skilled, and his language abilities, he spoke German, English, and some Chinese, made him valuable as a translator. In his diary, Bischoff wrote about the boredom, the endless sameness of prison camp life. The same meals, the same faces, the same routines. He missed Guam. He wrote about the friendships he'd made there, the Chamorro families who'd invited him to dinner, the music he'd played at local dances. He missed the ocean. Utah was landlocked. The Great Salt Lake was nearby, but it wasn't the same. It was dead water, too salty to sustain life. It reminded him of imprisonment, but Bischoff also wrote about small kindnesses, American guards who shared cigarettes, a camp commandant who allowed German cultural celebrations, Christmas and Easter, observed according to German traditions, medical care that saved the life of a sailor who developed pneumonia. Life at Fort Douglas was not cruel, but it was deeply, profoundly boring. The boredom bred tension. Some sailors adapted well. They accepted their situation and made the best of it. Others grew restless. By early 1918, rumors of escape attempts circulated through the camp. The guards got wind of it. In May 1918, several men, including Captain Zuckschwerdt, were caught planning an escape. The details are murky. Some accounts say they'd dug a tunnel. Others say they'd bribed a guard. Whatever the plan, it failed. Zuckschwerdt was punished with 25 days in the disciplinary barracks. Solitary confinement, reduced rations, no privileges. When he emerged, he looked older. The quiet captain who never raised his voice seemed deflated. He stopped talking about escape. He stopped talking about much of anything. In April 1918, all the prisoners from the Cormoran were transferred from Fort Douglas to Fort McPherson, Georgia. The reason for the transfer was never clearly explained. Some historians suggest Utah wanted the prisoners moved because the local economy was benefiting too much from their labor, and other states wanted a share. Others suggest the military wanted to consolidate German prisoners in fewer locations. Whatever the reason, the Germans boarded trains again. The journey across the country took a week. They passed through Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Some of the men had never seen this much of America. It was vast, city after city, farm after farm. The industrial capacity was staggering. Germany was starving. Its cities were being bombed. Its armies were collapsing. But here, America looked untouched, strong, rich. Fort McPherson was outside Atlanta. It was older than Fort Douglas, built before the Civil War. The climate was humid and oppressive in summer, but at least it wasn't the desert. The Germans were housed in wooden barracks. The conditions were similar to Fort Douglas, adequate but Spartan. The routine continued, work details, meals, roll calls. Letters home, carefully censored, waiting. Then, in November 1918, news arrived. The war was over. Germany had signed an armistice. The fighting had stopped. The Germans erupted in celebration, then almost immediately in confusion. Germany had lost. The Kaiser had abdicated. A republic had been declared. Everything they'd known, everything they'd fought for, was gone. But they were going home. The process took months. The American military had to repatriate thousands of German prisoners scattered across the United States. Ships had to be arranged, paperwork processed. By October 1919, nearly a year after the armistice, the Cormoran crew finally boarded a ship in New York Harbor. They arrived in Germany in late October 1919. The country they returned to was unrecognizable. The empire was gone. The economy was shattered. Millions of men were dead. Cities were hungry. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crushing reparations. Germany, once a great power, was defeated, humiliated, and broken. Captain Zuckschwerdt was promoted to commander despite the loss of his ship. The German Navy, now the Reichsmarine, was a shadow of its former self. Most of the fleet had been scuttled at Scapa Flow to prevent its seizure by the British. Zuckschwerdt was given a desk job. He hated it. In the 1920s, he left the military and went into business. He partnered with an American friend, Arthur Mazer, running a fur trading operation with ranches in Minnesota, Canada, Alaska, and Germany. It was successful for a while. Zuckschwerdt traveled back to the United States several times. In 1936, he visited Minnesota when the business went into receivership. He met with American lawyers, tried to salvage what he could. It was strange, he later wrote, to be back in America, the country that had imprisoned him, but also the country that had treated him fairly. He felt no bitterness. When World War II began, Zuckschwerdt was 65 years old. He should have been retired. But Germany needed experienced officers. In August 1940, he was called back to service. He was assigned as a port commander, first at Newport in Belgium, then at Calais in France. Later, he commanded coastal defenses at the mouth of the Loire River and in Languedoc in southern France. He was promoted to Konteradmiral, Rear Admiral, in March 1943. At 69, he was one of the oldest active duty officers in the German Navy. He served until May 1944, then finally retired. He didn't retire for long. When the Allies invaded Germany in 1945, Zuckschwerdt was in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Bavaria. British forces occupied the town in April. They arrested any German military personnel they found. Zuckschwerdt, despite being retired, despite being 71 years old, was taken into custody. He was held in a prisoner of war camp. Again. For the second time in his life. He wrote his memoirs there, 216 pages recounting his entire naval career, the training, the ships, the Pacific, Guam, the Cormoran, the first imprisonment, the fur business, the Second War. He wrote about duty and honor and the strange twists of fate that had defined his life. On July 1, 1945, Adalbert Zuckschwerdt died in that British POW camp near Heuvelhof. He was 71 years old. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, likely heart failure. He was buried in a military cemetery in Germany. The other members of the Cormoran crew scattered. Most returned to their families, tried to rebuild lives in a shattered country. Emil Bischoff, the machinist with the diary, became a customs officer. He moved frequently because of his job. In 1922, he married Elizabeth, a widow with 2 children. They had 3 sons together. One of them, Wilhelm, died in World War II. Elizabeth died in 1948. Bischoff lived until the 1960s, moving to Biebesheim, keeping his attaché case full of photographs and postcards from Guam. He attended annual reunions of Cormoran crew members, sharing stories, keeping the memory alive. Some of the sailors never forgot Guam. A few tried to return. Travel was difficult and expensive, but a handful made the journey in the 1920s and 1930s. They visited the graves of their shipmates. They saw the obelisk they'd erected. They walked the streets of Hagåtña, visited the cathedral, and looked for familiar faces. Some found their Chamorro wives, and the marriages somehow survived distance, time, and war. Others found that the women had moved on, remarried, and built new lives. The wreck of the Cormoran remained where she sank. 110 feet below the surface of Apra Harbor, the U.S. Navy conducted a salvage operation after the war. They recovered machinery, stripped the guns, and retrieved the ship's bell. The bell was placed in the U.S. Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis, Maryland, a trophy of America's first engagement in World War I. It remained there for decades. Then, tragically, it was stolen. It has never been recovered. The wreck itself was left alone. Over the years, coral grew on the hull. Fish made homes in the empty compartments. The cormoran became part of the reef, part of the harbor's ecosystem. Then, on August 27, 1943, during World War II, something remarkable happened. A Japanese cargo ship, the Tokai Maru, was sunk by the American submarine USS Snapper in Apra Harbor. The Tokai Maru settled to the bottom, and by chance, by sheer coincidence, she came to rest against the cormoran's stern. Her hull leaned against the propeller of the German ship. Two wrecks, one from World War I, one from World War II. Lying together 110 feet underwater. It's the only place in the world where you can dive on shipwrecks from both world wars in a single descent. Today, the site is one of Guam's most popular diving locations. Over 1,000 divers visit annually. They swim through the cormoran's corridors, past rusted machinery, through holes blown in the hull by the scuttling charge. They pass from the German ship to the Japanese ship, moving between wars, between nations, between different moments of history. The National Park Service maintains the site as part of the War in the Pacific National Historical Park. The wrecks were placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1975. They are protected. Divers can visit, but cannot remove artifacts. What remains of the ships belongs to history. In Hagåtña, the obelisk still stands in the Naval Cemetery. The 6 graves are well maintained. The U.S. Navy tends them. On the 90th anniversary of the scuttling, in 2007, a wreath-laying ceremony was held. American military personnel, Guam officials, and descendants of the German crew attended. On the 100th anniversary in 2017, a representative from the German embassy in Manila flew to Guam for the commemoration. The story of the SMS Cormoran is not well known. It's a footnote in most histories of World War I. When Americans think about the war, they think about the Western Front, the Argonne Forest, Belleau Wood. They think about doughboys in trenches, poison gas, machine guns, the terrible math of industrial warfare. They don't think about a small tropical island in the Pacific. About 370 German sailors who lived for 2 years among people who should have been enemies, but became friends. About the first shots fired. About the strange grace of burying your enemies with honor, about men trapped by history, by forces beyond their control, trying to maintain their humanity in impossible circumstances. But the story matters. It matters because it complicates our understanding of war. War is not always clean. It's not always a clear line between good and evil, friend and enemy. Sometimes, it's men who know each other's names, who've shared meals and stories, who genuinely like each other, forced by politics and borders and the momentum of empires to become combatants. Governor Smith understood this when he ordered full military honors for the German dead. The American Marines understood it when they pulled drowning German sailors from the water, working desperately to save men who, technically, were enemy combatants. The people of Guam understood it when they attended the funeral, when they wept for men they'd known as neighbors. And maybe that's the real lesson. That even in war, even when nations collide, and diplomacy fails, and violence becomes inevitable, individuals can choose mercy, can choose respect, can choose to see the humanity in the person across the line. The SMS Cormoran sailed into Apra Harbor on December 14, 1914, a desperate German raider running from superior forces. She sank in that same harbor on April 7, 1917, destroyed by her own crew rather than surrendering. 7 men died. 366 were imprisoned. All of them were forgotten by the larger narrative of the war. But on Guam, they're remembered. The obelisk stands, the graves are tended. The wreck remains, a monument underwater. And every year divers descend to touch history, to swim through the corridors of a ship that once carried men who became friends with their enemies, who built lives in captivity, who were caught between 2 worlds and did their best to maintain their dignity in both. That's worth remembering. That's worth commemorating. Because it tells us something true about war, about humanity, about the complexity of history that textbooks often flatten into simple narratives. The SMS Cormoran and her crew were the first shots, the first deaths, the first prisoners. But they were also something else. They were proof that even in war, friendship is possible, that mercy is possible, that we can honor our enemies without betraying our own. Captain Zuckschwerdt understood this. When he stood before the graves of his men and thanked the people of Guam for their kindness, he was acknowledging something profound, that the enemy had treated his dead with more respect than war required. That even in the moment of violence, when his ship was being seized and his men became prisoners, the Americans had chosen humanity over hatred. That choice echoes across the decades. It echoes in the obelisk that still stands, in the graves still tended, in the wreck that divers visit, in the stories that descendants tell. It echoes in the question we started with. What happens when friendship meets war? The answer, written in the waters of Apra Harbor, carved on a cement obelisk, buried in 6 graves in Hagotnya, is this: friendship doesn't have to die. Honor doesn't have to be abandoned. Humanity doesn't have to be sacrificed. Even enemies can be buried with dignity. Even prisoners can be treated with mercy. Even in war, we can choose to be better than war demands. That's what the men of the SMS Cormoran teach us. That's what the Americans on Guam demonstrated. That's what those 852 days of strange peace, friendship, built in the shadow of war, ultimately meant. It meant that when the moment came, when Lieutenant Bartlett stood on the deck of the Cormoran and delivered his orders, when Captain Zuckschwerdt made his terrible choice, when German sailors jumped into the water and American sailors jumped in after them, pulling them to safety, all of them, every single one, remained human. They remained capable of mercy, of respect, of recognizing each other not as enemies to be destroyed, but as men caught in circumstances beyond their control, doing their duty as they understood it. That's the real story of the SMS Cormoran, not the tactical details, not the geopolitical implications, but the human story. The story of men who proved that even in the worst circumstances, we can choose grace. And that's a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth diving 110 feet underwater to touch. Worth standing before a small obelisk in a cemetery and reading the names carved in stone. Den Toten von SMS Cormoran, 7th February 1917. To the dead of the SMS Cormoran, April 7th, 1917. They were the first, but in being the first, they showed us something essential about what it means to be human. Even especially when the world is trying its hardest to make us forget. If this story moved you, if it surprised you, if it made you think differently about war and friendship and the complexity of history, hit that like button. Every like tells the algorithm to share this story with more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories like this every week, pulling them out of dusty archives and bringing them back to life. Stories that complicate our understanding of history. Stories that remind us that the past was lived by real people making real choices in impossible circumstances. Drop a comment right now. Tell us, would you have made the same choice as Zuckschwerdt? Would you have scuttled your ship rather than surrender it, or would you have tried to save your crew at all costs? Have you heard stories like this from your own family's history? We want to hear them. You're not just a viewer, you're part of something important. You're helping to keep these memories alive. You're making sure that men like Captain Zuckschwerdt, like Emil Bischoff, like the 7 sailors who died in Apra Harbor, don't disappear into silence. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying throughout this story. Thank you for being here.